The rain had been falling for days when the German soldiers of the 275th Infantry Division eased out of their bunkers on the morning of the 16th of November, 1944, and looked west into the trees. They were dug into the eastern edge of a forest the maps called the Hürtgenwald, under a general named Hans Schmidt, and they had been expecting this. The attack was coming. Everyone along that line felt it. Through the wet furs their snipers settled into firing positions they had chosen and ranged days before, and scouts crept forward to listen. The forest in front of them ran for 50 square miles of close-grown evergreen, ground so dark that a man could lose sight of the soldier beside him at 10 paces. Fog pooled in the low draws. Below the ridge, a shallow stream called the Roer where ran cold and brown through the timber. A mile to the west, the Americans were finishing the last hot breakfast many of them would taste for 18 days. The story that came down afterward, the one repeated for years, held that the German riflemen in those woods came to believe something odd about the men they fought there. They said the Americans moved through the forest as though they had grown up inside it. The record tells a harder story, and it begins with the reverse being true. If this story is pulling you in, take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who's listening. To understand the Hürtgen, start with the men who held it. The German army of late 1944 was not the force that had overrun France 4 years earlier. Many of its divisions had been bled white in the long retreat and refilled with teenagers and older men, some of them barely trained. The 275th and the 353rd Infantry Divisions, defending the woods, were under strength and, on paper, unimpressive. Paper missed the thing that counted. A hard core of those German soldiers and the officers who led them had been fighting for years, and a good many had fought in the forests of Russia and Finland. They understood winter. They understood trees. They knew how to make a wood fight on their behalf, and the Americans coming at them did not yet know how a wood could be turned into a weapon. They had turned this one into a machine. They felled trees across the firebreaks and strung the trunks with wire. They dug bunkers and roofed them with logs and packed earth. They sowed the muddy trails with mines and zeroed their artillery on the few clearings where an attacker might pause, so that a halt in the open was to die. Above all, there was the timber itself. German gunners fused their shells to burst high in the canopy and throw down a rain of steel splinters and shattered wood onto anyone beneath. A soldier's instinct under fire is to drop flat on the ground. In the Hürtgen, going flat turned a man's back into a target for everything coming down out of the trees. The forest was a physical ordeal before a shot was ever fired. The ground rose and fell in a series of ridges running north to south, and the firs and hardwoods stood 75 to 100 feet tall, their lower limbs interlocking so thickly that from above the wood looked like a single sheet of green. The midday sun seldom reached the floor, leaving a permanent gray twilight under the branches. Through all of November, the temperature hung near freezing with an almost unbroken mixture of rain, sleet, and snow. Men lived in wet holes and could not get dry. Trench foot, the rot that had crippled the infantry of the previous war, crept back into the ranks. In the fog, a soldier often could not see more than a few feet ahead, and patrols got lost or stumbled into the enemy at arm's length. Dwight Eisenhower put the tactical problem plainly. The enemy, he wrote, held all the advantages of strong defensive country, and the attacking Americans had to depend almost entirely on infantry weapons because of the thickness of the forest. The woods canceled the things the United States Army did best. Tanks could barely move on the choked, muddy tracks and could not bring their guns to bear. The fog grounded the aircraft that might have broken a position open. This would be a foot soldiers' fight, settled by riflemen and machine gunners and mortar crews, and by little else. The Americans had already been bleeding in these trees for 2 months. The fight had opened back on the 19th of September, when the 9th Infantry Division pushed into the woods and learned how they killed. A single advance of about 2 miles cost that division close to 5,000 men. Worse came at the village of Schmidt, where the 28th Infantry Division was thrown against the German line at the start of November. 3 rifle companies and a machine gun platoon of its 112th Infantry held the village briefly, exhausted after a long trudge through the gorge of the Col, unnerved at night by snipers and by haystacks on a far hillside that seemed to shift and move in the moonlight. Their division commander, General Norman Cota, stayed miles to the rear in the village of Rot and did not come forward for days. The position came apart under German counterattack, and Schmidt became one of the costliest single reverses an American division suffered in the whole war. By the time the 4th Division's turn arrived, the forest had already swallowed the better part of several divisions. The regiment ordered across the southern stretch of the woods on the 16th of November was the 22nd Infantry of the 4th Infantry Division, one of 10 divisions committed that day to a wider offensive called Operation Queen. They called themselves the Double Deucers. Their motto was deeds, not words. They had landed at Utah Beach on the 6th of June, taken heavy losses through Normandy, rebuilt, and earned a name as one of the premier infantry regiments in the European theater. One of their chaplains, Captain William Boyce, called them a fighting machine trained to an efficiency not matched at any time during the war. They were led by Colonel Charles Lanham, 42 years old, a West Point graduate, a former instructor at the infantry school, and a published poet. His pre-war work writing infantry manuals had drawn the notice of General George Marshall, who kept his name in a private list of officers marked for higher command. Lanham led from the front to the edge of recklessness and demanded the same of his lieutenants. Before the battle, he told them what was coming. He expected his officers to lead their men, he said, because men follow a leader, and he expected his platoon leaders to be right up front. Losses, he warned, could be very high. Use every skill you possess. If you survive your first battle, I will promote you. Good luck. Lanham's regiment held a front of 3 miles inside a forest that ran roughly 20 miles by 10, hemmed by the German cities of Aachen and Düren and the town of Monschau. Aachen had fallen on the 21st of October, the first major German city taken by the Allies, and the larger aim now was to drive through to the Roer River and seize the dams that controlled its flow. As long as the enemy held those dams, he could open them and flood the low ground in front of any Allied crossing. So the High Command wanted them taken before the broad push to the Rhine began. Between the Double Deucers and that open river plain lay 5 miles of trees. The men who saw the Hürtgen reached for older nightmares to name it. Ernest Hemingway, covering the war for Colliers and a friend of Lanham, called the battle Passchendaele with tree bursts, summoning the drowned slaughter of the Western Front in 1917. General J. Lawton Collins, who commanded the corps, called the forest a green hell. General James Gavin of the 82nd Airborne called it an ice-coated Moloch with an insatiable appetite. None of them were reaching for effect. On the morning of the 16th, the lead companies of the 22nd waded the cold Roer and began climbing the Fur Ridge beyond it. The first day went better than they had any right to expect. They made ground. They fell short of their objectives, but they were moving, and for a few hours the thing looked possible. Then, in the words of one of the soldiers who lived it, all hell broke loose. The German artillery found them in the trees. A lieutenant named Mason, watching the rounds come in, said the enemy's timed fire was the most perfect he had ever seen, the shells bursting 30 and 40 feet above the ground directly over the advancing men. There was no clean answer to it. The Americans learned, fast and at a price, to stop throwing themselves down and instead to press flat against the trunks of the biggest trees, so that the splinters and steel coming from overhead found less of them. They learned to roof their foxholes with logs and earth before they did anything else, because an open hole in the Hürtgen was a grave waiting for a tree burst. The instinct that had kept them alive in the hedgerows of Normandy was the wrong one here, and the forest charged its tuition in blood for every lesson. The cost fell hardest on the men who led. Within 3 days, every one of the regiment's battalion commanders had been killed or wounded. Casualties among the junior officers and sergeants who ran the rifle companies climbed past anything the manuals had a category for. Gains were counted in yards as German guns hammered the advance. Mines blocked the trails, so the wounded had to be carried by hand 1,500 yards back to the regimental aid station, because no vehicle could reach them. German counterattacks came on with armor the Americans could not answer in the timber. Some companies dropped to 50 men still standing. When 2 of the rifle companies finally fought their way to one stretch of open ground at the wood's edge, they had between them a single officer and fewer than 100 men. The wounded had the worst of it. A man hit in the open could not always be reached, and one who could be reached still had to be carried out on a litter over root and mud and fallen timber, jolted at every step, often under fire the whole way back. Some died on that journey who might have lived with a clear road behind them. The cold worked on everyone alike. In the freezing wet the boots never dried, and trench foot pulled men out of the line as surely as bullets did, until in places the rot took nearly as heavy a toll as the fighting. The gray half-light under the canopy wore on the mind as much as the body. There was no front of face and no rear that was ever truly safe. Only trees in every direction and the wait for the next shell to come down through them. And the forest betrayed the attackers in a way few had been prepared for. Because the 22nd and 8th Infantry to its north were advancing in parallel columns through dense woods, their flanks hung open, and German troops slipped in between and behind them. At one point the regiment had to stop entirely, turn around, and clear its own rear of infiltrators who moved through the trees as if the forest were their own back garden, while engineers bridged a stream so that food and ammunition could reach the men cut off ahead. This was the truth beneath the legend. In those first days, it was the German soldier, not the American, who moved through the Hürtgenwald like he had grown up inside it. The Americans were the strangers in the wood, and the wood was killing them. What turned it was not a flash of brilliance from above. No order arrived that solved the Hürtgen. What changed was the men, one hard lesson at a time, in the only school that counted. They learned the firebreaks. The long, straight lanes cut through the timber looked like the natural way forward, which was exactly why the German gunners had ranged them to the yard. The survivors learned to read those lanes as kill zones, and to keep off them, to move instead in small knots through the standing trees, using the trunks for cover and the gloom for concealment. They learned to fight as the forest demanded, in fragments, squad against squad, at ranges of a few yards where a man might hear his enemy before he ever saw him. They learned to push scouts out ahead, and to move at first light or in the murk, when the German observers could see least. They learned to listen, because in that fog sound carried further than sight, and the snap of a twig or the scrape of a shovel marked a position better than any map could. None of this had been in the manuals they trained on at home. All of it was paid for in the men who did not learn it in time. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications. There's far more in the record still to cover, and your support is what keeps these stories coming. Here the American infantryman carried one advantage the trees could not strip away. By late 1944, he was the only foot soldier in any army on Earth issued a semi-automatic rifle as standard. The M1 Garand fired as fast as a man could squeeze the trigger, struck hard with its .30-06 round, and stayed accurate in trained hands out to 400 or 500 yards. In the close work of the Hürtgen, that heavy round had a second virtue the men prized. It drove through brush and through the light log cover the Germans sheltered behind in a way lighter cartridges could not. Set that rifle beside the Browning automatic rifle in each squad, and a handful of disciplined men could throw out a weight of aimed fire that unsettled even the experienced soldiers across from them. The Germans in the forest had years of woodcraft behind them. The Americans had firepower in the hands of the individual riflemen, and they were learning, quickly, how to bring it to bear among the trees. None of this made the German defender any less dangerous. His belt-fed machine guns fired far faster than anything in an American squad, and one of them, well-sighted to sweep a firebreak or a draw, could pin a whole company to the ground. The Americans did not beat the forest by outshooting its defenders. They beat it by refusing to stop, and by producing, again and again, individual men who would do the thing that had to be done. By the end of the third week, the fighting had closed on a village called Grosshau, near the eastern lip of the forest, and it was there that the character of the whole battle showed itself, in the act of one man. His name was Macario García. He had been born in 1920 in the Mexican state of Coahuila, one of 10 children of farm workers, and his family had crossed into Texas in 1923 in search of something better. He grew up picking crops. He was working on a ranch near Sugar Land when the Army drafted him in November of 1942. He spoke little English, and he had no stake in the quarrels of Europe beyond the one every soldier has, which is the men on his left and his right. He had gone ashore in Normandy on the 6th of June, been wounded on the beach, spent 4 months putting himself back together, and rejoined Company B of the 1st Battalion as the regiment ground into the woods. He was not yet an American citizen. On the 27th of November, he was serving as an acting squad leader. That day, Company B was advancing on a wooded hill that could be reached only across thin, meager cover when German machine gun fire pinned the whole company to the dirt, and artillery and mortar rounds began bursting through the branches above them. Garcia had already been hit, wounded in the shoulder and in the foot. He refused to be carried back. Instead, on his own, he crawled forward alone through the fire until he was close to the nearest machine gun nest, then rose and took it with grenades and his rifle. Bleeding, he did not stop. He crawled the open ground again and went after the second gun the same way. When it was over, his Medal of Honor citation records that he had destroyed 2 emplacements, killed 6 of the enemy, and captured 4, and that only after the company had taken its objective did he allow himself to be carried off for treatment. President Harry Truman placed the Medal of Honor around his neck at the White House on the 23rd of August, 1945. Macario García was the first Mexican immigrant ever to receive it. What he did at Grosshau was extraordinary by any measure, and it was also the whole battle in miniature. There was no clever maneuver to be had, no flank to turn, no armor to call forward, no airstrike to crack the position open. There was a wooded hill, a dug-in enemy who knew precisely where to lay his fire, and a wounded man crawling forward through the trees because the only way through the Hürtgen ran straight through the worst of it. The last villages did not come cheap. Ordered to take Grosshau by direct assault, the one company in position to make the attack was pinned down almost at once and stayed pinned for 3 hours, until a force of American tanks worked up from the south and drew off enough of the German fire for the infantry to move. The fight went house to house in the night before the place was called secure. There was no pause after it. The regiment pushed the last yards to the forest's edge, where the timber finally thinned and the men could see open ground and daylight ahead. The Roer plain they had been told lay 5 miles away when they had crossed the Roer 18 days before. The price of those 5 miles is in the records, and it is hard to take in. By the Army's own accounting, the 22nd Infantry suffered 2,773 casualties in 18 days, 85% of its normal strength of 3,257 men, to capture 1 village and about 6,000 yards of forest. Roughly 1 man fell for every 2 yards of ground taken. The rifle companies that had gone in averaging about 160 soldiers were down near 87 within a week, and holding even that number took a steady feed of replacements into the line. Total replacements ran to nearly 2,000 men. By the end, casualties among the rifle company leaders had reached an estimated 1.5 times their original number, which is to say the men who walked point and gave the orders had on average been hit and replaced, and in many cases hit again. Every battalion commander had been lost in the first 3 days. The regiment that came out of the Hürtgenwald was not the regiment that had gone in. The Germans paid in the same coin. General Rudolf Christoph von Gersdorf, Chief of Staff of the German 7th Army, said afterward that the fighting in the Hürtgen was worse than anything he had seen on the Russian front, and put alongside the great battles of attrition from the last 2 years of the First World War. That was the judgment of a professional soldier who had watched the Eastern Front with his own eyes. Their own divisions were ground down and patched with men who should never have been near a front, their supplies hauled forward by hand over roads that had dissolved into mud, and still they made the Americans pay for every 100 yards. 2 professional armies were feeding each other into the same stand of trees, and the trees took both. Whatever the German riflemen came to think of the men climbing toward them out of the Roer Valley, it had the shape of the respect one worn-out professional pays another across a few yards of killing ground. This is where the legend and the truth finally meet. By the time the survivors of the 22nd reached the far edge of the forest, the men coming out of those trees did fight as though the wood belonged to them. They moved through the timber with a hard competence the green soldiers of the 16th of November had not owned. A German rifleman watching them in those last days would have seen exactly what the old story claims he saw: an enemy who looked as if he belonged in the forest. The story only gets the cause wrong. That fluency was not carried across an ocean from some boyhood spent in the woods. It was beaten into them, lesson by lesson and death by death, across 18 days in the worst ground the Western Front had to give. They did not grow up in the forest. The forest made them, and the schooling cost more than most battles cost in full. The Battle of the Hürtgen Forest did not end when the 22nd reached the plain. It ground on into the winter, and before it was finished, elements of 17 American divisions had been fed into the woods. It became the longest battle the United States Army ever fought on German soil, and the second longest single battle in the Army's entire history, behind only the 3-month agony of Bataan. American casualties across the campaign ran to at least 33,000 men, with thousands more lost to trench foot, exhaustion, and the cold, the kind of casualties that never reached the headline figure. The Germans lost on the order of 28,000 of their own. The dams that were the supposed prize did not pass firmly into American hands until February of 1945, and many who studied the battle afterward judged that the forest need never have been fought for at all, that the Hürtgen was a wound the First Army inflicted on itself. The men who bled there were not asked for that opinion. They were handed a forest and an order, and they took the forest. The fighting in the woods is usually dated to have ended on the 16th of December, 1944. That was the morning the German army threw its last great reserve into a surprise attack a short distance to the south, through another belt of dense forest in the Ardennes. The American infantry that met that blow among the trees, dug in, holding, killing at close range in the snow, was an army that had just been to school in precisely this kind of war. The Hürtgen had taught nothing that anyone wanted to learn. The men who lived through it had learned it regardless. Macario García came home to Texas in February of 1945, a staff sergeant wearing the nation's highest decoration. What waited for him is its own comment on the country he had fought for. Not long after his return, he was refused service at a restaurant near Richmond, Texas, because he was Mexican. A fight broke out, and Garcia, a holder of the Medal of Honor, was the one arrested. The charges were eventually dropped. He became an American citizen in 1947, earned a high school diploma in 1951, married, raised 3 children, and spent 25 years as a counselor for the Veterans Administration, helping other men carry what they had brought home from their own wars. He died in a car accident on the 24th of December, 1972, and was buried with full military honors at the National Cemetery in Houston. A street in that city bears his name today, and a mural on a firehouse wall, so that the boy who once picked crops near Sugar Land is not forgotten. Colonel Lanham lived through the forest, rose to general's rank after the war, and stayed close to Hemingway for the rest of the writer's life. The chaplain's old praise of the regiment, a fighting machine trained to an efficiency not matched at any time during the war, reads very differently once you know what that machine was poured into. The Hürtgenwald is quiet now. The trees have grown back, dense and dark as they were, and walkers on the forest paths still come across the shallow depressions in the ground where men once dug their holes and roofed them against the bursting shells. The villages have been rebuilt. Not far away, in the long ordered rows of the American cemetery at Henri Chapelle and others like it, lie the men of the 4th Division and the rest who never came out of the trees, their names cut into white stone. Hikers there are still warned to keep to the marked paths, because the ground holds live shells and mines from that autumn. 80 years on, patient are the leaves. There is a temptation, looking back at a battle like this one, to turn it into a story of national character, to say that something in the American soldier had always suited him to the woods. The men who were there knew better. They knew that the soldier who entered the Hürtgen on the 16th of November and the one who came out of it 18 days later were not the same man, and that the distance between them had been cut by the forest at a price no one would have chosen to pay. Deeds, not words. The regiment's motto turned out to describe how it learned, one deed at a time, the words arriving later, if they arrived at all. Go back, at the last, to that wet morning on the 16th of November, and to the German riflemen of the 275th easing out of their bunkers to watch the tree lean. They were waiting for an enemy who did not yet understand their forest, and on that first morning they were right. What they could not have known was what that enemy would become by the time he reached the far side of the wood. The legend says the Americans moved through the Hürtgen as though they had grown up in it. The record says something harder, and in its way something greater. They learned it where they stood, and the cost of the lesson is written into the ground of the forest and the stone of the cemeteries that ring it. Thank you for staying with us until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen carry the story forward. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one.